I've never told anyone this story before. Not my therapist, not my family, not even the police when I filed that missing persons report 2 weeks later. But it's been eating at me for months now, and I think I need to get it out. Maybe if I say it out loud, it'll stop following me home. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm what you'd call an experienced hiker. Been doing solo trails around Portland for about 3 years now, ever since my divorce. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that helps me think clearly, you know? Like all the noise in my head just quiets down. I started bringing my camera about a year ago, and night photography became my thing. There's this raw beauty in capturing waterfalls under moonlight that you just can't get during the day. Eagle Creek Trail in the Columbia River Gorge was my go-to spot. I'd hiked it probably 30 times, knew every switchback, every creek crossing. It's popular during the day, families, tourists, the usual crowd. But after sunset, it becomes this completely different place. The old-growth forest closes in around you, and those steep canyon walls make you feel like you're hiking through some ancient cathedral. That night in October, I was feeling particularly confident. Fresh batteries in my headlamp, backup flashlight, fully charged phone, and my camera gear. The weather was perfect, clear skies, almost full moon. I started the trail around 9 p.m., planning to shoot the lower waterfalls and be back to my car by 1 a.m. Simple night out. The first hour went exactly as planned. I got some incredible shots of Punchbowl Falls with the moonlight hitting the mist just right. The forest was alive with its usual night sounds: owls, rustling leaves, the constant whisper of moving water. I felt that familiar peace settling over me, that sense of being exactly where I belonged. It was around 11 p.m. when I first heard the footsteps. At first, I didn't think much of it. Other photographers sometimes did night shoots, and Eagle Creek wasn't exactly a secret spot. The steps were steady, measured, maybe 50 yards behind me on the trail. I stopped to adjust my camera settings, and the footsteps stopped too. When I started walking again, they resumed. Probably just another night owl like me, I thought. So I called out, "Hey there." Beautiful night for photography, isn't it? Nothing. Just the sound of water over rocks and wind through the trees. I shrugged it off and kept walking. But something felt off. The footsteps behind me were too perfectly timed with mine. When I took a long step over a fallen log, I heard that same long step echo behind me. When I paused to check my footing on a rocky section, the steps behind me paused at exactly the same moment. That's when I decided to test something. I've always been a whistler. Nervous habit, I guess. So I started whistling this little tune my grandmother used to sing. Just a simple melody, nothing fancy. Within seconds, I heard it echoed back to me from the darkness behind. But it was wrong. The tune was right. The rhythm was right. But there was something fundamentally off about it. Like hearing your own voice played back on a recording, but distorted. The notes were too sharp in some places, too flat in others. And underneath the melody, there was this breathy, hollow quality that made my skin crawl. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped. I stopped whistling. The echo stopped too. My heart was hammering now, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was just acoustics, the way sound bounces off canyon walls. Maybe there really was another person back there, someone who was just being playful. But every instinct I had was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I picked up my pace, not quite running, but definitely not taking my time anymore. The footsteps behind me picked up pace too. I started whistling again, a different tune this time, something from a commercial I'd heard on the radio. Within moments, that same distorted echo came floating back through the trees. Except this time, it continued long after I'd stopped. The thing behind me kept whistling my grandmother's lullaby, over and over, getting more distorted each time. What had started as an almost human sound was becoming something else entirely. Something that had learned the shape of music, but didn't understand what music actually was. I was practically jogging now, my camera gear bouncing against my back. The trail should have been leading me back toward the parking area, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The moonlight that had seemed so helpful earlier was now casting everything in weird, twisted shadows. Trees I should have recognized looked alien and threatening. That's when I started seeing the markers. Pieces of old rope tied around tree branches at eye level, strips of faded cloth knotted to bushes, a child's backpack hanging from a branch like some kind of grisly ornament, its bright blue fabric now moldy and torn. Each marker felt deliberate, purposeful, like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the forest, or like warnings. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was deep in the gorge now, surrounded by rock walls and dense forest. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when I tried to use my phone's flashlight and realized my headlamp was flickering. I'd put fresh batteries in before I left, AAA lithium batteries that should have lasted for hours. But my headlamp was dimming, casting weaker and weaker light with each passing minute. Soon, I'd be stumbling through the forest in complete darkness, with whatever was behind me getting closer. The whistling had stopped being a single voice. Now it was coming from multiple directions. Left, right, sometimes from above, as if something was moving through the tree canopy. The tune had degraded into something barely recognizable, just sharp notes and hollow breath sounds that seemed to bounce off every rock face and tree trunk in the canyon. I was lost, completely, utterly lost on a trail I'd hiked dozens of times. That's when I saw the light. Not electric light, firelight. Flickering orange light coming from somewhere ahead and to my left, off the main trail. Against every horror movie instinct I'd ever developed, I pushed through the underbrush toward it. Whatever was back there in the darkness felt more threatening than whatever might be waiting by that fire. What I found was a campsite, but not a normal campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing, hidden from any official trail. There was a fire ring made of stones, but the fire had burned down to just glowing embers. Around the clearing, scattered like some kind of bizarre museum exhibit, were personal belongings from different decades. A leather hiking boot from the 1980s, judging by the style. A modern smartphone in a cracked waterproof case. A film camera that looked like it was from the 1970s. Backpacks in various states of decay. Camping gear ranging from vintage to brand new. And in the center of it all, wrapped in a plastic bag and wedged between two rocks, was a journal. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The entries were from different people, written in different handwriting, spanning what looked like several years. But they all told variations of the same story. Day 1, got turned around on Eagle Creek Trail. Something's been following me since sunset. Keeps making sounds like me. Day 3, found this camp. Other people have been here. Thing won't let me leave. Keeps whistling. Food running low. Day 7, it's learning. Yesterday it said my name. Today, it said my daughter's name. How does it know my daughter's name? The entries got progressively more desperate, more illegible. People had been trapped here for days, sometimes weeks. And the most recent entry, written in shaky block letters, was dated just 2 weeks ago. My name is Marcus Williams. If someone finds this, tell my wife I tried to come home. It's been 12 days now. The thing doesn't just mimic anymore, it talks. It knows things about my life it shouldn't know. Last night it stood at the edge of the firelight and looked just like me. Exactly like me. I think it's almost ready. Ready for what? I wondered. I flipped to the last page with writing and found my answer, scrawled in what looked like blood. It goes to town, wears our faces, lives our lives. No one ever knows. That's when the whistling stopped. Complete, absolute silence fell over the forest. No wind, no water sounds, no night birds. Just oppressive, suffocating quiet that pressed in on me from all sides. The kind of silence that means something is listening. I didn't wait to see what. I grabbed the journal, stuffed it in my jacket, and ran. I crashed through underbrush, stumbled over fallen logs, scraped my hands raw on rough bark. My headlamp died completely, leaving me in total darkness. But I kept running. Branches whipped across my face, and thorns tore at my clothes. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw a miracle. The reflective markers that lined the official trail. I'd somehow found my way back. I followed those tiny glowing dots like a lifeline, running as fast as my exhausted legs could carry me. My car was sitting exactly where I'd left it in the parking area, looking impossibly normal under the sodium lights. I've never been so happy to see that beat-up Honda Civic in my life. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and drove straight home without looking back. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with the journal and my laptop, reading those desperate entries over and over while searching missing persons databases. Marcus Williams, 34, from Gresham, Oregon. Reported missing by his wife on October 3rd after failing to return from a day hike on Eagle Creek Trail. Last seen at the trailhead around 6 p.m. No trace found despite extensive search efforts. The date matched the journal entry perfectly. But that's not the part that keeps me awake at night. 3 days after I found that journal, Marcus Williams walked into the Gresham Police Department, alive and perfectly fine. Told them he'd gotten disoriented on the trail and spent 2 weeks surviving in the wilderness before finding his way out. His story checked out. His wife was overjoyed. Case closed. I saw the news interview they did with him. He looked exactly right. Same height, same voice, same mannerisms. But when the reporter asked him about his experience in the forest, Marcus smiled. It was his smile, his face, his everything. But for just a moment, at the very end of that smile, I swear I heard something. A sound so faint the microphones probably didn't pick it up. He was whistling. My grandmother's lullaby, perfect pitch, perfect rhythm. I moved to downtown Portland the next week. Sold all my camera gear, never went hiking again. Started seeing a therapist, taking medication for anxiety, the whole deal. For months, I almost convinced myself it was all some kind of stress-induced breakdown. Then, last Tuesday night, I was in my 6th floor apartment with all the windows closed, watching Netflix with the volume up high. And I heard whistling. That same distorted melody, floating up from the street below. I don't know how it found me. I don't know what it wants. But I think it's still learning. And I think I taught it something new that night. If you're listening to this and you live in Portland, maybe don't whistle when you're walking alone at night. You never know what might whistle back. This is being recorded because I don't think I have much time left. My name is Jake Morrison, and I need someone to know what really happened in the Superior National Forest 3 years ago. Not the sanitized version I told the park rangers, not the lies I've been telling my therapist. The truth. Because in 2 days, I have to go back to that place. And this time I don't think I'm coming home. I'm a former Marine. Did 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming back to northern Minnesota in 2019. The transition wasn't easy. Hell, it never is for any of us. PTSD, nightmares, the whole package that nobody talks about until it's too late. The only thing that kept me sane was getting back into the woods where I grew up. These forests were in my blood, passed down through generations of Morrisons who made their living as loggers and guides. My grandfather, Tom Morrison, taught me every trail, every stream, every hidden valley in the Superior National Forest. He was half Ojibwe, and he knew stories about these woods that went back centuries. Most of them I dismissed as folklore, the kind of tales old-timers tell to keep kids from wandering too far from camp. But there was one place he always warned me about, a bog area about 15 miles north of Grand Marais, accessible only by unmarked deer trails that most people would never find. That water remembers, Jake, he used to say. Some places in these woods are older than anything we understand. The Blackwater Bog is one of them. The old people, they knew to stay away after dark. They knew what lived underneath. When I was a kid, I thought he was just trying to scare me. As an adult, especially after what I'd seen overseas, I figured it was just another superstition. Swamp gas, optical illusions, the kind of stuff that spooked people who didn't understand nature. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. It was a cold October night when I decided to face my childhood fears head on. I'd been struggling with some particularly bad episodes, flashbacks to a drone strike I'd called in that went wrong, civilian casualties that haunted my sleep. My therapist said confronting fears was part of healing, so I figured I'd hike through the bog area and prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. I knew the way, despite having avoided it for 27 years. The deer trail started behind an old logging road, wound through dense stands of birch and pine, then dropped down into the wetlands, where the water turned black as crude oil. It was beautiful country during the day, pristine wilderness that few people ever saw. At night, under a crescent moon, it felt like walking through a graveyard. The first part of the hike was peaceful, familiar. I remembered summers spent in these woods with my grandfather, learning to read animal tracks and identify plants. He'd been dead for 5 years, but being out here made me feel close to him again. For the first time in months, the constant tension in my shoulders started to ease. The bog itself was exactly as I remembered, a kidney-shaped area of dark water surrounded by tamarack trees and moss-covered hummocks. The water was so still, it looked like black glass, perfectly reflecting the scattered stars above. My headlamp beam penetrated maybe 3 feet before being swallowed by the darkness below. Just water, I told myself. Just a normal bog. I started picking my way around the edge, using the raised areas of solid ground to avoid stepping in the water. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since I'd entered the wetlands, and my breath came out in visible puffs. That should have been my first warning. Bogs don't create their own microclimates like that. It was around midnight when I first saw them. My headlamp swept across the water surface, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving underneath. Not fish. The shapes were too big, too human. I stopped walking and aimed my light directly down into the water. Nothing. Just black water and maybe some fallen branches on the bottom. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe some marsh gas or decomposing vegetation creating optical illusions. But as I continued around the bog, I kept seeing them. Human-shaped shadows moving slowly beneath the surface, always just at the edge of my light beam. Then the water started to bubble. Not like a natural spring or trapped gas. This was different. The bubbles rose in deliberate patterns, forming circles and spirals on the surface. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on the vegetation around the water's edge. That's when I heard my name. Jake. The voice came from underneath the water, muffled but unmistakable. A voice I'd heard 1,000 times during my childhood, teaching me about respect for the forest and the old ways. My grandfather's voice. Jake, you shouldn't have come here. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the slippery moss. This wasn't possible. Hallucinations, maybe, brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But the voice came again, clearer this time. The water remembers, Jake. It remembers everything. The dark water began to churn, and shapes started rising from the depths. Human figures, perfectly preserved, eyes open and staring. Men and women of different ages, still wearing the clothes they died in. Some looked recent, hiking gear, modern outdoor clothing. Others were older, much older, wearing clothes that belonged in a museum. And at the center of them all, rising from the deepest part of the bog, was my grandfather. He looked exactly as he had the day he died. Weathered flannel shirt, worn jeans, the turquoise bracelet my grandmother had given him. But his skin had the pale, waxy quality of something that had been underwater for years. And when he opened his mouth to speak, black water poured out. "You carry darkness, Jake. The bog can smell it on you. All the lives you've taken, all the innocent blood on your hands." The memory hit me like a sledgehammer. That village outside Kandahar, the intelligence report that turned out to be wrong, the drone strike I'd called in on what we thought was a Taliban meeting house. 12 civilians dead, including 3 children. Their faces had been haunting my dreams for 3 years. "This is a place of judgment," my grandfather's spirit continued. "The water calls to those who carry guilt. It offers them peace or justice." The other figures in the water began moving toward shore, their movements slow and deliberate. I could see their faces now. Men and women who'd come to this place, carrying their own burdens of guilt and shame. Some looked peaceful, as if they'd found the absolution they were seeking. Others looked angry, hungry, desperate for someone else to join them in their underwater purgatory. The black water began to rise, creeping up the banks of the bog like reaching fingers. Where it touched the moss and grass, vegetation withered and died instantly. It was moving toward me, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just water anymore. It was taking on form, reaching out like liquid tentacles trying to drag me down into the depths. "You have a choice, Jake," my grandfather said. "You can join us here, find peace in the eternal darkness. Or you can leave, but only if you make amends in the world above. The scales must be balanced." The water was at my feet now, ice cold even through my boots. I could feel it trying to pull me in, and part of me wanted to let it. The guilt, the nightmares, the constant weight of what I'd done. It would all be over. No more therapy sessions, no more sleepless nights, no more faces of dead children in my dreams. But another part of me, the part that my grandfather had raised to respect life and fight for what was right, rebelled against that easy escape. "What kind of amends?" I gasped. "Use your pain to heal others. Help those who carry the same burdens you do. The dead children of Kandahar. Honor their memory by saving the living." The water receded slightly, waiting for my answer. "I promise," I said. "I'll help other veterans. I'll start a program, a foundation, something. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to balance the scales." My grandfather nodded slowly, and the other figures began sinking back into the depths. "We will be watching, Jake. Every month, you must return here and report your progress. Miss a meeting, break your promise, and the bog will call you home permanently." The water retreated rapidly, leaving me standing on solid ground as the first light of dawn began filtering through the trees. The temperature returned to normal. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the bog looked like nothing more than an ordinary wetland again. But I knew better now. I understood what my grandfather had been trying to tell me all those years ago. I kept my promise. Started the Morrison Foundation for Veteran Mental Health Services. We've helped hundreds of former soldiers deal with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the invisible wounds that come with war. Every month for 3 years, I've returned to the bog to report what we've accomplished, to show that I'm holding up my end of the bargain. Until last month, my wife was in the hospital, complications with her pregnancy. I couldn't leave her side, couldn't make the trip north. I thought surely one missed meeting wouldn't matter, that the spirits would understand. I was wrong. 3 days ago, I started hearing my grandfather's voice again, calling my name from every body of water I passed. Puddles, streams, even the coffee in my morning cup. They all reflect his face looking back at me. The message is clear. My time is up. So that's why I'm recording this. Tomorrow night, I have to go back to the Blackwater Bog for the final time. I've made arrangements for the Foundation to continue without me. My partner, Sarah, knows what to do, even if she doesn't know why I'm leaving. If someone finds this recording, know that I went willingly. The guilt was killing me slowly anyway. At least this way, my death might mean something. The bog demands balance, and maybe my sacrifice will let others find the peace I never could. The water remembers everything, and it never forgets a debt. If you're still listening to these stories, you probably understand why they need to be told. Some experiences are too dark to carry alone. A like or a comment helps keep these voices alive, helps make sure their warnings don't get forgotten in the darkness. I'm recording this on my phone because I don't know how much time I have left. My name is Rebecca Torres, Becca, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Arizona. Or I was. I might not live to defend my thesis. If someone finds this recording, please understand that I'm not crazy. I know how this sounds, but everything I'm about to tell you is true. And right now, as I speak, I can hear him pacing on my roof. Back and forth, like he's been doing for 3 weeks now. I study folklore and anthropology, specifically Native American protective legends and their psychological functions in modern communities. My thesis was supposed to examine how traditional stories serve as boundary markers, ways of keeping people away from dangerous places or activities without explicitly explaining the real dangers. The Superstition Mountains east of Phoenix were perfect for my research. The area is rich with Apache legends, stories that have kept treasure hunters and casual hikers away from certain areas for generations. Most academics dismiss these as simple superstition, but I wondered if there might be practical reasons behind the warnings. Unstable terrain, abandoned mine shafts, dangerous wildlife. Things that would be easier to explain with stories about vengeful spirits than detailed geological surveys. That's how I first heard about the Pacing Man. I was interviewing Mary Crow Feather, an Apache elder in her 70s who still lived on the reservation. She was one of the few people willing to talk to me about the old stories, though she always seemed uncomfortable doing it. Some stories aren't meant for outsiders, she told me during our second meeting. Some stories exist to protect, not to entertain. But when I pressed her about the Superstition Mountains specifically, she went quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "There's something up there that walks the ridges. The old people called him the Pacing Man. He guards the sacred places, the burial grounds our ancestors chose carefully." According to Mary, the Pacing Man appears as a tall figure in old-style clothing, a broad-brimmed hat, long coat, boots that make no sound on stone. He walks back and forth along the mountain ridges, always moving, never resting. Most people who see him from a distance think he's just another hiker, but there's something wrong about the way he moves. Too fluid, too tireless. He marks those who disturb what should be left alone, Mary said. Once you're marked, he follows you. He paces around your home, your workplace, wherever you try to hide. The pacing only stops when he collects what he came for. I asked her what happens to people he collects, but she just shook her head. Some knowledge has a price, Rebecca. Be careful what you go looking for. I should have listened to her. I should have found a different thesis topic. a safer legend to investigate. But I was young and skeptical, and absolutely convinced that I could separate folklore from fact with proper scientific methodology. I planned my expedition carefully. Solo night hike to Weaver's Needle, one of the most prominent formations in the superstitions and central to several Apache stories. I brought recording equipment, cameras, GPS tracker, emergency supplies. My plan was to document any unusual phenomena I encountered, then compare my experiences with the traditional stories. The hike started at sunset from the Peralta trailhead. The superstitions are beautiful in their own harsh way. Saguaro cacti standing like sentinels, jagged rock formations carved by millions of years of wind and flash floods, desert stretching to the horizon in every direction. As night fell, the temperature dropped from brutal to merely uncomfortable, and the desert came alive with its nocturnal residents. For the first few hours, everything was exactly what I expected. Coyotes calling in the distance, the occasional screech of a great horned owl, the scurrying of small mammals through the brush. My recording equipment picked up normal desert sounds. My cameras captured normal desert imagery. I was actually starting to feel smug about my scientific approach to local superstition. It was around 2 a.m. when I reached the plateau below Weaver's Needle. The area was clearly significant. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock faces, and pottery shards were scattered across the ground, like broken memories. I was careful not to disturb anything, taking photographs and measurements, while staying on what appeared to be a natural pathway through the site. That's when I heard the footsteps. Rhythmic, measured steps on stone somewhere above me. I looked up toward the ridgeline and saw a silhouette moving back and forth against the star-filled sky. A tall figure in what looked like period clothing. The broad-brimmed hat Mary had described was clearly visible. Another researcher, I thought. Someone else doing night field work. I called out a friendly greeting, but got no response. The figure continued its measured pacing, never pausing, never varying its route. Back and forth, like a sentry walking a post. I decided to approach and introduce myself properly. Graduate students doing fieldwork should stick together, especially in remote areas like this. But as I started climbing toward the ridge, something strange happened. The figure vanished. Not gradually, not by walking behind a rock formation. It simply wasn't there anymore. I swept my headlamp beam across the entire ridgeline and saw nothing but empty stone and scraggly desert vegetation. When I backed down toward the plateau, the pacing resumed. I tried this several times, approaching the ridge, watching the figure disappear, backing away, seeing it return. Always the same pattern. Whatever was up there didn't want to be approached, but it wasn't leaving either. That's when I made my first real mistake. In my excitement to document the phenomenon, I stepped off the natural pathway to get a better camera angle. My foot came down on what looked like solid ground, but I felt something shift underneath. Loose stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, not random scree. The pacing stopped immediately. I looked up at the ridge and saw the figure standing perfectly still, facing directly toward me. Even at that distance, I could feel its attention like a weight on my chest. The desert, which had been full of small sounds and movements, went completely silent. My recording equipment started malfunctioning. The digital audio recorder began playing back sounds I hadn't heard during the hike, voices speaking in what sounded like Apache, though the words were distorted and overlapping. My camera's LCD screen flickered between normal display and images I definitely hadn't taken. Close-up shots of weathered bones and pottery fragments, as if someone else had been using my camera to document a burial site. That's when I realized what I'd done. I'd stepped on a grave. The loose stones weren't random scree. They were a burial cairn, carefully arranged according to Apache tradition. My weight had disturbed the pattern, shifted stones that had been placed with sacred intention generations ago. I tried to fix it, to put the stones back exactly as they'd been, but it was too late. The damage was done, and whatever spiritual boundary had existed, there was broken. The figure on the ridge began moving again, but this time it wasn't pacing back and forth. It was coming down toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen when it reached me. I grabbed my gear and ran, stumbling down the rocky slope in the dark, branches tearing at my clothes and thorns ripping my skin. Behind me, I could hear steady footsteps following at the same measured pace I'd observed on the ridge. The figure didn't hurry, didn't seem concerned that I was getting away. It followed with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. I made it to my car just as the eastern sky was starting to lighten with false dawn. As I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, my headlights illuminated the trail behind me. The pacing man was standing about 50 yards away, perfectly still, watching me. In the headlight beams, I could see him clearly for the first time. Tall and gaunt, wearing clothes that belonged to another century. A long, dark coat, worn boots, and that broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. But it was the way he stood that made my blood freeze. Too straight, too perfectly balanced, like something that had forgotten how living people were supposed to move. He raised one arm and pointed directly at me. Not threatening, just marking, like he was filing me away for future reference. I drove home thinking I'd escaped, that whatever I'd encountered in the mountains would stay in the mountains. I was wrong. That first night back in my apartment, I heard footsteps on the roof. Slow, measured steps, back and forth from one end of the building to the other. The same rhythm I'd heard on the ridge. I called the building manager, convinced someone was actually walking around up there. He went up to check and found nothing. No footprints in the dust. No signs that anyone had been there. But I could still hear the pacing, clear as anything. It's been 3 weeks now. Every night, without fail, the pacing man walks back and forth on my roof. Neighbors don't hear it, I've asked. Security cameras show nothing unusual. But I know he's there, marking time until he's ready to collect what he came for. I tried going back to Mary Crow Feather for help, but she took one look at me and stepped back like I was carrying a disease. "You're marked," she said. "I can see it on you like a shadow. There's nothing I can do now." I asked her how long I had, how long the pacing would continue before whatever comes next. She wouldn't answer directly, but she did tell me one more thing about the pacing man legend. The spirits of our ancestors chose their resting places carefully, she said. Places of power. Places where the boundary between worlds is thin. The pacing man guards those boundaries. When someone disturbs them, breaks them, he comes to restore the balance. How? I asked. By taking the one who broke the boundary back with him. The living world loses someone. The spirit world gains someone. Balance restored. I've been researching missing persons cases in Arizona, specifically people who've disappeared in the Superstition Mountains over the past century. There are dozens of them. Hikers, treasure hunters, photographers, researchers like me. People who went into the mountains and simply never came back. Now I think I know what happened to them. The pacing on my roof is getting louder, more insistent. And last night, I heard something new. The sound of footsteps in my hallway, outside my apartment door. He's getting closer, bolder. I don't think I have much time left. If someone finds this recording, please tell my family that I'm sorry. Tell them I was trying to preserve important cultural knowledge, even if I went about it the wrong way. Tell Mary Crow Feather that she was right. Some stories exist to protect us from truths we're not ready to face. And if you're ever hiking in the Superstition Mountains, if you see a tall figure pacing along the ridges, don't approach. Don't investigate. Don't let curiosity override wisdom. Some boundaries exist for good reason. The footsteps have stopped. I can hear my apartment door opening. I can hear him coming down the hallway, those measured steps getting closer. If you're hearing this recording, it means the pacing finally stopped. It means he found what he came for. I need to tell you this story quickly, because I don't think I have much time before they realize what I'm doing. My name is David Kim, and what I'm about to share will sound impossible, but I'm looking at an invitation right now. Crisp white paper, elegant calligraphy, addressed to my 18-year-old nephew. I know exactly what it means because I received one just like it 15 years ago. And tomorrow night, I'm going to have to deliver it to him, whether I want to or not. I inherited my Uncle Carl's cabin when I was 31. Carl was the family black sheep, lived alone on the Olympic Peninsula for 20 years, rarely spoke to anyone, not even at family gatherings. When my parents told me he died of a sudden heart attack and left me his property, I barely remembered what he looked like. At the time, I was going through my own rough patch. Lost my software development job when the startup I worked for went under, and I was struggling to figure out what to do next. The cabin seemed like a perfect opportunity, a quiet place to regroup. And once I cleaned it out and sold it, I'd have enough money to fund my own business venture. The property was beautiful in that uniquely Pacific Northwest way. Dense rainforest, towering Douglas firs, and western red cedars. Everything covered in that bright green moss that makes the whole forest look like something out of a fairy tale. The cabin itself was modest, but well-maintained, sitting in a small clearing about 5 miles from the nearest road. No cell service, no neighbors for miles. Exactly the kind of isolation I thought I needed. I spent the first day just walking around, getting familiar with the place. Carl had been meticulous about maintenance. The generator worked perfectly. There was plenty of firewood stacked under tarps, and the cabin was surprisingly clean for someone who'd been living alone in the woods for decades. It was on the second day, while going through Carl's belongings, that I found the hidden room. I was clearing books off a shelf in what appeared to be Carl's study, when the whole bookshelf shifted. Behind it was a narrow door that opened into a space I never would have known existed. The room was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, but it was packed with things that made my skin crawl. Candles of different sizes and colors, arranged in specific patterns on the floor. Jars filled with what looked like herbs, bones, and other things I didn't want to identify. Books written in languages I didn't recognize, with illustrations that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And journals. Dozens of journals, all in Carl's careful handwriting. I started reading, thinking they might give me some insight into why my uncle had chosen to live like a hermit. What I found instead was a record of 15 years of occult practices and ritualistic gatherings. According to Carl's journals, there were 13 families in the area who had been participating in monthly gatherings for over a century. The old families, he called them, names I'd never heard before, but Carl wrote about them like they were close friends. The Hendersons, the Washingtons, the Blacks, the Grays, families who had settled in the Olympic Peninsula in the 1800s and discovered something in the deep forest, something that required tending. The entries got more disturbing as I read deeper. Descriptions of rituals performed under the full moon, references to the sleeper in the deep wood and maintaining the binding. And then, about halfway through the first journal, I found my name. David is showing promise, Carl had written. Strong will, logical mind, but also Kim family blood. He'll be resistant at first, but the forest will call to him when the time comes. He's expected to take my place when I'm no longer able to serve. I felt cold despite the warmth of the cabin. Carl had been writing about me for years, making plans for my involvement in whatever these people were doing. I flipped through more journals, finding dozens of references to me, to my family, to some kind of obligation that stretched back generations. That's when I found the invitation. It was sitting on Carl's desk in the hidden room, sealed in an envelope with my name written in elegant calligraphy. Inside, on heavy paper that felt expensive and old, was a formal invitation to a gathering in 3 days' time. Midnight, at the traditional place in the forest. Dress was listed as ceremonial robes provided. At the bottom, in smaller text, were the words, "Your attendance is required. The obligation passes to you." I'm a logical person. Software development trains you to think in terms of cause and effect, problem and solution. What I was looking at was obviously some kind of cult activity, and I wanted no part of it. I took the invitation, along with all of Carl's occult materials, and burned them in the fireplace. Then I packed my things, planning to leave first thing in the morning and never come back. That's when things started going wrong. My car wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over, despite the battery being fine and all the lights working. My phone, which had been getting at least 1 bar of signal since I'd arrived, showed no service at all. Even the emergency call function was disabled. I tried to stay rational. Cars break down, cell towers go offline. There were logical explanations for everything. I could hike out to the main road and call for help from there. But as I started preparing for the hike, I noticed that the forest had gone quiet. Completely quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, no sound of wind through the trees. Just oppressive silence that pressed in on the cabin from all directions. That's when I heard the first footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps moving through the forest around the cabin. Not the random patterns of animals, but measured, purposeful movement. Like someone was walking a perimeter, circling the property again and again. I peered out the windows, but couldn't see anything in the dense forest. The footsteps continued until dawn, then stopped abruptly when the sun came up. The next morning, I found new invitations nailed to every tree within sight of the cabin, all identical to the one I'd burned, all addressed to me. The paper was pristine despite the morning dew, and the nails holding them up looked like they'd been there for years, not hours. I tore them all down and burned them too. But by evening, they were back. Carl's journals had mentioned what happened to family members who tried to refuse their obligations. The entries were vague, but unsettling. References to forest justice and the price of breaking old agreements. I found one entry that chilled me to the bone. Tried to contact David's father today, but learned he died in that car accident last year. The forest doesn't forget debts, and it doesn't accept substitutes. The obligation always passes down the line. David is the last of his generation. There's no one else to take his place. That night, the footsteps returned, but they weren't alone. I heard voices calling my name from the darkness, speaking in harmony like some kind of choir. The voices were coming from different directions, circling the cabin just like the footsteps had. David. David. Come to us, David. I barricaded the doors and tried to ignore them, but the calling continued until dawn. And when morning came, I found something that made my blood freeze. Animals. Dead animals arranged in careful patterns around the cabin. Squirrels, rabbits, a deer, even birds, all laid out in precise geometric shapes, like some kind of offering or warning. There was no sign of violence on any of them, no blood, no wounds. They looked like they had simply laid down to die in exactly those positions. On the final night, the night of the gathering, the forest became something else entirely. The oppressive silence was replaced by a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The air grew thick and heavy, like the atmosphere before a severe thunderstorm. but the sky was clear. I tried to stay inside, tried to wait it out. But as midnight approached, I felt a compulsion I couldn't resist. The cabin door opened on its own, and my legs carried me outside, despite every rational part of my mind screaming at me to resist. Lights were moving through the forest, not flashlights or lanterns, but orbs of pale, cold light that drifted between the trees like living things. They formed a path leading deeper into the woods, and I found myself following them without conscious choice. The path led to a clearing I'd never seen during my daytime explorations, though it felt familiar somehow, like a place I'd visited in dreams. 13 figures in dark robes were standing in a circle around what looked like an ancient stone altar. They were completely silent, completely still, waiting for me. As I entered the circle, they began to chant in a language that sounded older than English, older than any human language should be. The words seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones, in my blood, in the deep places where instinct lives. One of the figures approached me and removed her hood, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a grandmother's smile, the last person you'd expect to find in a forest cult. "Welcome, David," she said. "We've been waiting for you." She explained that the 13 families weren't just participating in rituals for their own purposes. They were guardians, bound by agreements their ancestors had made with something that slept deep beneath the Olympic Peninsula, something ancient and powerful that could never be allowed to wake. "Your Uncle Carl tried to break the binding," she told me. 3 months ago, he decided he was too old to continue the work. He thought he could simply walk away from his obligations. "What happened to him?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. "The forest doesn't accept resignations," she said simply. "When someone tries to break their binding, the sleeper stirs. And when the sleeper stirs, people die. Car accidents, heart attacks, sudden illnesses. The forest finds a way to collect what it's owed." That's when I understood. Carl hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been killed for trying to abandon his post, and now the obligation had passed to me. They gave me a choice: accept the binding willingly, or watch as everyone in my family line suffered the same fate as Carl. My parents, my sister, her children. The forest would take them all until someone stepped forward to fulfill the Kim family obligation. I thought about running, about fighting, about finding some way to break a curse that had been binding my family for generations. But looking into that clearing, seeing the ancient altar and the patient faces of people who had been carrying this burden their entire lives, I knew there was no escape. The binding ritual was simple but permanent. They cut my palm with a knife older than the United States, let my blood drip onto the altar stone, and spoke words that seemed to rewrite something fundamental in my DNA. I felt the change immediately, a new awareness of the forest around me, of the sleeping thing deep beneath our feet, of my role in keeping it contained. That was 15 years ago. For 15 years, I've attended the monthly gatherings. I've learned the chants, performed the rituals, felt the sleeper's dreams pressing against the barriers we maintain. I've watched other family members die when they tried to refuse their obligations, watched their children step forward to take their place. And now, it's happening again. My nephew just turned 18, my sister's son, the next generation of Kim blood. Yesterday, I received an envelope in my mail, not delivered by any postal service, but simply waiting for me on my kitchen table when I woke up. Inside was an invitation identical to the one I'd received all those years ago, but with my nephew's name written in that same elegant calligraphy. The compulsion is already starting. I can feel the forest's will pressing against my own, urging me to deliver the invitation, to bring him to the next gathering. I've tried to resist, Tried to warn him, but every time I start to speak the truth, the words die in my throat. The binding doesn't just make you a guardian of the sleeper. It makes you a recruiter for the next generation. I'm telling you this story because it might be the only way to get the truth out before I'm compelled to lie to him, to convince him that this is just a family tradition he needs to honor. Maybe if enough people know what's really happening, someone will find a way to break the cycle. But I doubt it. The forest has been collecting guardians for over a century, and it's very good at making sure its secrets stay buried. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, if you have family who disappeared into the woods or died in suspicious accidents, maybe you should start asking questions about old agreements and forest obligations. And if you ever receive an elegant invitation addressed to you personally, inviting you to a gathering at midnight, don't burn it. That just makes them angry. These stories, they stay with you, don't they? The darkness has a way of finding us all eventually. Thanks for listening, for keeping these voices alive in the telling. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and some warnings are too important to let die in silence. Sweet dreams.